Hello. Um, the video I'm going to make here is a subject I don't really want to talk about because it's depressing. It's not something that is pleasant to think about, but it's a very real problem. And when I started off with my YouTube channel, I always said to myself that nothing was going to be off limits. There was going to be no issue that was too taboo for this channel. So what I want to discuss is the problem of knife crime, particularly in London, although I suppose you could extend this to Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, but particularly London. Um, there has been, once again, this debate has somewhat opened up again or come into the public domain. On New Year's Eve, there were four young men stabbed to death in London, which even by London standards is bad. Four young men in one night. And perhaps it's even worse by the fact that none of these incidents were related. So this wasn't like one single bad incident where four young men died. This was four separate cases across the capital in different boroughs, miles apart. Um, Now, before I continue with this, so there's a number of things I want to discuss. What sort of measures can maybe decrease this, the impact on Sadiq Khan's mayoralty, and a number of other issues. But before I continue, I want to say that context is important. London is a city of almost 9 million people, and if you compare London to many megacities around the world, for example, Moscow, Sao Paulo, Karachi, indeed New York City, London is still significantly safer than a lot of other major cities. Nevertheless, just because it's safer on a world scale doesn't mean that we should be complacent. London still has some very serious problems that in my view, really are a stain on the capital. I believe London's probably the greatest city in the world, and these are things that are not inevitable. I don't think you'll ever have a situation where a city of almost 9 million people will not record a single murder. I think that's almost impossible. I think with the best policing in the world, with the best policies in the world, unfortunately, with a large concentration of people, um, there's always going to be a homicide rate, unfortunately. But this has brought some concern again because the homicides recorded for 2017 are in fact the highest in a decade. Um, there have been a period where things have been somewhat improving, and I'm going to provide some statistics here. This is from The Guardian. Now, that's significant because The Guardian is not a reactionary, it's not the Daily Mail. It's not the sort of newspaper that sensationalizes crime. If anything, it's a very left wing newspaper, and if anything, it would be very much of the school of thought of, taking a very liberal lefty attitude to crime. But this is from their figures, and they are as follows. In the year 2008, 24 teenagers were killed by knives in London. 24. Now, at the time this report was published in November last year, the figure was 18. So that's still lower than 2008, but that's higher than all the previous years since 2008. So clearly that is an almost 10-year high. So clearly something has been going wrong in the capital. You could argue there's a bigger population, um, but I think there may be a lot of things at play. Now, clearly, knife crime is not a black and white issue. There are a lot of complex factors involved in this, as is often the case with crime. But one thing is for absolute certain: the first responsibility of any mayor of London, any mayor of any city for that matter, but particularly when you're in the position of having the highest personal mandate of any politician in the country, it's a significantly powerful position, the mayor of London, then increasing scrutiny will be put at your doorstep over what happens on your watch. Now, um, Boris Johnson became mayor in 2008. He left the mayoralty in 2016. And in that period, there was a decline in the number of stabbings in London. That's not to say that there weren't problems, but there was a decline. Now, I don't think it would be fair to blame Sadiq Khan for absolutely everything, but in recent days he's come out with statements I personally find quite concerning. Um, for example, he said that on his watch he's going to absolutely stop and search as a policy matter. I have concerns about that because stop and search is one of those things that is going to really divide opinion. I do think it needs to be executed in a responsible way, but I think completely getting rid of it would be incredibly reckless. And in my opinion, it's Khan pandering to political correctness and identity politics before the safety of Londoners. Now, regarding the terrorist attacks that happened in London last year, I don't think it's entirely fair again to say, oh, because he's mayor, this happened. I honestly think that ISIS is hell bent on, committing these sort of attacks, and any mayor of London is going to find a challenge. I also, to be fair to Khan, what many of his opponents often dig up is he said that terrorism's part and parcel of being in a big city. To be fair, I think that's probably taken out of context. I think all he was saying was that in a major city will be targeted, basically. And that is a statement of fact. Um, I mean, London is far more likely to be targeted than where I live, Sunderland. Okay, so I think it's a little unfair to put too much weight on that statement. Maybe Khan should have been a little bit more responsible in the way he said it, but I do think that was the context. He was simply stating a fact. London's a major global world city. Of course, it's going to be a target for terrorists, just as Paris and New York City and Moscow and every other major city is. So I think some of his opponents put too much weight into that statement. Nevertheless, it is irrefutable London does seem to have become a more unstable city since Kant took over. And I think there would be a range of factors for that. Now, in terms of knife crime, here we're only talking about the actual fatality figures. That's not including the many people who are stabbed and wounded. I'm not sure what the figures are for that, but I imagine they're a good deal more. Um, I despise gang culture, whether it be in London or anywhere in the world. I think it's toxic. I hate it, and I really think that it is. Few things depress me more than gang culture because it ruins the quality of life in any city. It's a plague on everyone, and there is a lot of things to look at. I don't think with something like knife crime you can solve it overnight, but I do think that any measures that are proven to reduce crime have to be adopted. And I do have an issue with political correctness or identity politics, virtue signalling, being put before the safety of Londoners. And when Khan says he's going to completely abolish stop and search, that to me seems to be him pandering to so called community leaders who are saying it's racist. Well, this thing about stop and search being racist, that is a very contentious issue. And I want to discuss a little bit how I feel about that. You have to work with facts, right? And the fact of the matter is, in London, there is a disproportionate number of young black men involved in knife crime. It's just a fact. So, speaking about that problem, if a white politician speaks about it, the idea that they are racist is just a way of trying to silence debate around this. If they say something like all young black men are thugs, that is racist because it's a generalization. But no one can keep a straight face and say there isn't a problem with young black men in the capital getting involved in knife crime. That isn't to say that young Asian men and young white men aren't also involved. But when you have something that is disproportionate, it has to be discussed. And it's similar issues in the States, though I would argue on a much bigger scale. And it must still be remembered that the average American city is still far more dangerous. I mean, far smaller. So, when certain self righteous Americans say, oh, look at London, look at the problems you're having, I would retort, well, you get cities like New Orleans, St. Louis, which are a lot smaller than London and have far higher homicide rates. So, with all due respect to our American cousins, you're in no position to point fingers. Nevertheless, we do have a problem. And We have to really recognize this as a severe problem. And I don't think that political correctness should be part of that. By the way, when it comes to identity politics, again, I think that gets in the way because it's saying that all black people would be against the idea of stop and search. That is not true. Damilola Taylor was a young boy murdered in London. I believe it was the year 2000. It was a case that shocked the nation. His father has taken a very conservative approach on issues of crime. Um, Black man. Okay, this is a black family, and he strongly supports stop and search. This idea that all black people take a left wing liberal attitude to crime, I think, is misleading because black people don't want to be victims of crime any more than anyone else. So, if anything, it is racist to assume that all black people want to take this identity politics approach. That if you talk about, for example, black on black crime, that must be racist. Um, So-called black community leaders that are more keen on shouting racist than on dealing with this problem should be thoroughly ashamed of themselves because all they are doing is putting up barriers to keeping Londoners, all Londoners, safe. And I find that utterly infuriating. There are a lot of things that need to be looked at, and anything that is seen to be working needs to be explored. Now, I'm not saying that stop and search can definitively be shown to reduce crime, but it seems to me common sense that the more potential knife offenders are stopped, then the stronger the chances are of reducing knife crime. This just seems common sense to me. Now, there will be some who will counter this and say, but then that destroys trust with the police. And that is an argument I respect. It's an argument I can understand. And for what it's worth, if I was black and and I was innocent and I was constantly stopped by the police, would I feel frustrated? Yeah, I would. It would make me feel that I was being targeted because of my skin color. But should the police work on evidence or should they work on the basis of whether or not they offend people? I think there has been great improvements made within the Met. I think, for example, if we compare the situation today to the situation in the 1980s, the itself is far more diverse, and that is a very, very important thing. If you have black officers stopping young black men, then it's harder to push this claim, oh, it's racist. So I think representation within the police is extremely important because that brings up a situation of improving trust. And I know it's been a similar situation in some American forces. I believe it was in Dallas. Dallas is another example where that has greatly improved, which is why when those officers were shot in Dallas, it was such a sad situation because Dallas had been one of the forces that had been improving in its community relations. So I do think London's come a long way since the days of the mid 80s. But there's no question about it. London is a deeply divided city, and there are real social problems out there. So when it comes to reducing knife crime, I think there are a number of things that need to be looked at. Absolutely, poverty is an aspect. Though I've always had an issue with poverty in itself being blamed or being used as a way to condone crime or a way to even explain crime, because that's saying that everyone who is poor is a potential knife thug, and that's a smear on all poor people. Um, some of these people, some of these braggadocious knife criminals are not exactly living in rags. They've got smartphones, they are sometimes dealing with significant cash. So I don't accept that poverty alone is a factor. And bear in mind, a lot of the victims are from working class backgrounds. So it's certainly a very important thing, but I don't think you could dismiss it as just that issue. I do think that knife arches, practical measures like knife arches, can be proven to have an effect. I know they were introduced after the murder of the head teacher in 1995. I forget the man's name now, but that was another groundbreaking or game-changing situation. Um, I think knife amnesties can work, but I would have a limited time on that because it's no good saying, and I can understand why they're controversial because it kind of looks like selling out to criminals. But if they're proven to work, then they need to be adopted at least temporarily. I would say something like, okay, 2 weeks. If you are carrying a knife in London, we give you a chance, put this into the knife bank, you're not going to be prosecuted. When I lived in the Midlands, it was tried in Wolverhampton. I don't know what sort of effect it had on the crime levels there, but I do remember it was tried. Um, Knife arches, knife amnesties. But then on top of knife amnesties, after that's been tried, then take a zero tolerance approach. I do believe that there needs to be very tough penalties for knife offenders. It's no good, and that's where there needs to be more scrutiny of judges. But I believe that's true of crime across the board. It's no good the police, work hard to apprehend people, and then someone is put before a court and they've stabbed somebody and then they're sentenced to a few months. That's not good enough. Sentencing has to match the crime. And I'm aware that there are a range of other issues going on in prisons. You know, there's a lot of issues to do with penal reform, etc., rehabilitation. And I've spoken at length about those issues. But I do believe, as a fundamental principle, you can't have a situation where people are stabbing someone, in some cases total strangers, and the judge gives them a tap on the wrist. No one can rationally say that sort of situation is acceptable because then we totally have moral breakdown. I mean, you can't have a situation where someone stabs a total stranger for looking at them the wrong way, and then some weak judge gives them a few months. Not good enough. So, yes, I think there has to be more pressure on judges to actually give sentences that reflect the gravity of the crime. And we also need to challenge some of the arguments that are made. Oh, why carry a knife for protection? Well, everyone makes that excuse. It's the same excuse about dangerous dogs being used by certain gangs in London. Here's the point: if it is applied equally to every knife carrier, that excuse becomes void. And the final point I would make in terms of dealing with this, yes, there is a social aspect to this where popular culture plays a role. And this is going to be a controversial point, but this is how I feel. Grime music, right? R&B music, grime music, rap music. I defy anyone to honestly say with a straight face that music that explicitly promotes gang culture, drugs, fast money, and machismo lifestyle doesn't have a negative effect. Um, I think if there's real honesty about this, real honesty, then people will concede that there are some young men out there, not some, probably quite a few, who listen to this music. They listen to it every day. And at some point, that does start to have an influence on their attitude to the outside world, their attitude to um, to dealing with disputes, their attitude to women, their attitude to a whole range of issues. And it really irks me when people say there's absolutely no connection. Oh, it's just art. The minister Kim Hiles, junior minister Kim Hiles, got in hot water a few years ago because he said that what this basically does is promote. I'll try and find the exact quote here, if you bear with me. I'm looking at the Wikipedia article. Um, who made comments that some Grime supporters claim to find deeply racist. And he described grime music as boasting macho idiot rappers. Well, I personally agree with that. It's if when you look at the videos, how can you honestly dispute that? So basically, he was being pilloried and smeared as a racist for simply calling it what it is. And this is why I think that we have to be very careful not to automatically attach this with representing an entire community. Yes, it's true that grime music is popular among young black men in London, um, but that doesn't mean every single black person likes it. And if you are automatically going to shout, oh, racist, whenever these things are discussed, I mean, provide evidence for that. Did Kim Hoyle say that all young black men are racist? Excuse me, are thugs? No, he didn't. That's why these so-called community leaders really, really frustrate me because they're not interested in solutions. You know, when it comes to music, I do believe in live and let live for the most part. I also agree that not all that genre of music sends out negative message. I get that you do get, for example, R&B music and rap music that sometimes does have a positive message. I've heard, for example, rap videos that are speaking out against knife crime. Great. But frankly, I'd like to see a lot more of it. I guarantee you, you type in any grime video, and at some point you're going to come across lyrics that are glorifying gang lifestyle. Now, if I say that, I'll either be accused of being a racist, which is nonsense, or living some sort of sheltered lifestyle, which again is nonsense. I don't accept the argument. In fact, there was a counter argument to Kim Hoyle's statement by Jeff Chang, who's an American rapper, and he claims that they were simply capturing and encapsulating and preserving the life that he and his peers live in the streets every day. No, I think that's a dismissive attitude, and I think it's basically a way of avoiding any responsibility. And that's another issue responsibility. At some point, there has to come a situation where you stop blaming the government, stop blaming the police, and start taking some damn responsibility for your own behavior. Because when young offenders are arrested, or when you get former young offenders who are now youth workers, they always blame the government, they always blame the police. Just for once, I would like to say someone say, well, actually, we need to start challenging our own attitude to things. Why should it always be a case of giving in to their demands? And incidentally, anyone who lives in London and says they're bored, that's, I'm sorry, but stabbing someone and then using boredom as an excuse is something I've no respect for. Um, so, what I'm saying here is that when it comes to knife crime, I think there are an amalgamation of issues at hand. There is a range of causes, but there are a range of solutions. Let's look at all of them. And if Khan is saying we're going to stop and search because some people will see it as racist, we're going to stop it completely. That to me is a gamble, especially when knife crime is on the rise. Khan needs to be seen to be actually taking measures that are proven to have an effect on reducing this. Because even if London is safer than Sao Paulo or Moscow or other world cities, the fact is, for many Londoners, there is a real aspect of feeling that their city is becoming more dangerous. And I'll be honest, whenever I visit London, I don't consider myself a coward, but I am wary. I admit I am wary. So I really believe that this gang culture, we need to stop treating it like it's art. It's not. It's braggadocious, machismo bullshit. I mean, look at the videos for goodness sake. When you get young guys who have balaclavas on, who are wielding knives, give me a break. You're telling me that has no effect? I might, in fact, make a specific video about this, but I get that their lives may not be the same as mine. I get that I'm not experiencing their world, right? But okay, make videos where you're talking about those problems, but you're also condemning them and saying, let's reduce knife crime. That's also a way of talking about the life, right? So I get a little bit tired of some pretty powerful people in the music industry who just won't take any responsibility. And who say, oh, it's always the fault of the police or the government. Now, in terms of stop and search, okay, you may have a risk where there are some officers who are prejudiced who will target young black men simply because they don't like them. I concede you may have that issue. But the police also need to be empowered to act in in terms of public safety. So if they feel that they recognize someone, for example, they've dealt with them before and they have been up for knife offences, then common sense dictates they're going to stop that person again, even if they're not carrying a knife on that occasion. And I understand if you are innocent and you're constantly being stopped. It would frustrate the hell out of me. I get that. But if that's the issue, we'll then start speaking out and condemning knife culture as well, because that is why the police are in a position where they have to act when it comes to stop and search. And if the evidence is that the majority of knife crime in London is being perpetrated by young black men, then surely they have to act on evidence. And we should never, ever, ever have a situation where discussing the facts, the plain facts, is secondary to political correctness. Like, you can't say it's young black men because that's racist, except it's the truth. And that's what makes me so angry about this situation, because so called community leaders, whenever a white politician discusses these problems, immediately, oh, it's because of racism. I'm not saying that there isn't racism out there. I'm not saying that there aren't some officers who will have racist attitudes, but I honestly believe these days they are a small minority. And I do believe the police have greatly improved in terms of being representative of the communities they represent. That is extremely important. But if stop and search is proven to work, then quite frankly, that is more important. Increasing the safety of Londoners is more important than some people being irritated because they've been inconvenienced. The police should be respectful about it. You know, they shouldn't be aggressive in the way they're doing it. And I will always condemn police abusing their power, right? But if an officer's being polite and saying, "Look, I need to check you. Can you please empty your pockets?" then I will support that if it is proven to reduce crime levels. It's different if they're saying, if they're being aggressive about it. So I do think their conduct is important. But if an officer has serious ground for suspicion, they should be empowered to act on that. So I really think it's an amalgamation of all these things. And I think that there has to be more responsibility from some powerful people, for example, in the grime industry. Grime artists who've made millions from their music can't just turn around and say, oh, it's all the fault of the government. If they've been successful in this industry, they need to start taking responsibility and saying, well, okay, it's not all the fault of the music. Fine, I'll give them that. But at least start condemning that machismo culture. That's why I despise the attitude that basically there is no responsibility except for the government and the police. Nonsense. There is responsibility within the community, and it starts by people reflecting on themselves and saying, well, wait a second, what about my attitude? Right, I know this was lengthy, but there were a lot of issues to cover. Thanks for watching, and if you're a Londoner, I'd really like to know your thoughts, because it is a much bigger problem in London than in other cities. Low, Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, every sizable city will have its issues, London in particular. But in my opinion, there is nothing more important for a mayor of London than the safety of Londoners. And if that means being smeared as a racist, that unfortunately is the price he or she would have to pay.